Burson Audio is an American audio manufacturer that I've not had a chance to review products from until now, and I've been very curious to take a look at them. They take a bit of a different approach to most other amp manufacturers, particularly in their focus on swappable op amps that users can change out or roll, as well as generally making very high power designs. This is the Burson Conductor 3X reference. It's not actually part of their current lineup, it has been replaced by something else, so this model isn't in current production, but the results from my testing of it have left me feeling like I have to talk about it, and not for particularly positive reasons. I'm GoldenSound, you're watching the Headphone Show by Headphones.com. This is an X-demo unit that I actually purchased myself. This was not sent by Burson, and on that note I should mention, we now have YouTube membership. If you sign up to be a member on the YouTube channel, 100% of the funds from that goes towards us on the content team and the content budget, which allows us to go to more places, do more stuff, and buy in things to review that we wouldn't otherwise be able to cover. You also get access to exclusive videos and polls that help you to show what you want us to cover next and drive the direction of the channel.
I believe in the native tongue, this would be called a dumpy.
So do check that out, it helps us out a lot. The Conductor 3X reference is not just a headphone amp, but rather a headphone amp and a DAC. You can hook up USB, SPDIF, Bluetooth, or analog inputs via these XLR connections on the back. But the first thing that surprised me when testing this unit was the analog inputs on this device, for two reasons that you should be aware of. Firstly, if you feed just a normal 4V line level signal from any balanced DAC, let alone a higher 5V signal from some DACs, the inputs will get clipped. Actually, you have to lower the signal level to around 3.5V in order to avoid clipping it. So that was pretty surprising and quite frankly disappointing, because standard line level signal for balanced connections is 4V, and it clipping with 4V is going to make it somewhat incompatible with most DACs. But then there's also a good reason why you might not want to use an external DAC with this and just use it as a combo unit, because the analog inputs on this are not actually, as it seems, fully analog. When I tested just outputting a normal sine wave from the analog outputs of my audio analyzer into this and measuring what was coming out of the headphone output, I noticed that sometimes, though weirdly not always, the two channels weren't quite perfectly in phase with each other. One of them was slightly delayed compared to the other one, and the fact that that only happens sometimes was a bit weird in itself, but also an analog amplifier shouldn't really be able to be doing that. Unless it's not actually analog, unless the signal is getting converted back to digital and something's going wrong there. To be a bit more certain about the ADC conversion, I did a bit of a sneaky test. I noticed that when using the analog inputs, there's some unusual high frequency noise right around the 96 kHz cutoff that would exist if the DAC or ADC was running at a 192 kHz sampling rate. So I tried playing a tone right at 100 kHz. First off, that produced an aliased or image tone, which all but confirms it is going through an ADC DA pipeline. But I also, just to be sure, tried changing the DAC's digital filter setting, something that shouldn't affect anything for an analog signal path. But sure enough, changing from a fast to a slow oversampling filter on the DAC changed both the noise profile, the level of the tone, and in fact the level of the aliased or imaged component produced by the resampling filter. So there's not really any point using a fancy third-party external DAC with this, because the signal's just going through a bunch of extra steps and getting converted back to digital anyway. You're still just using the internal DAC. And also, using the analog inputs on this, the device performs noticeably poorer than just using the digital input and going straight to the internal DAC. Luckily for most of my testing, I was using this as a combo unit. I always do my measurements after I've completed my subjective listening, because I don't want the results of the measurements to bias or influence what I'm hearing and my subjective opinions on something. The reason that I'm preloading a lot of the measurements at the beginning of this review, and why I'm not going to talk about sound just yet, is because unfortunately there's still a couple more warnings, and some pretty strong ones, that I need to talk about first. As part of my normal test suite for amplifiers in particular, I always do a startup shutdown test. I look at what the activity at the output of the device is when you start it up from cold or shut it down from warm, because we want to make sure that it's not going to play anything loud through your headphones or potentially cause any damage. Something like a ferrum ore, for example, has under about 2 millivolts of output activity when you start it up or shut it down, so even on sensitive IEMs you might hear a very faint click, but that's about it. It's not going to cause any worry regardless of if you've got headphones on, and it's certainly not going to cause any damage. On the Burson, when I shut it down from warm, sometimes it would pump over 30 volts through the headphones. Over 30 volts. This is quite possibly dangerous, and I absolutely would not recommend that you turn this device on or off either via the front button or the power supply. Both have the same effect whilst you've got anything connected to it. It could damage something, especially don't do it whilst you've got headphones on your head. Furthermore, you also shouldn't connect any headphones to it too soon after turning it on, because when I first turned it on from cold, it has a fairly meaningful DC offset for the first minute or two until it starts to warm up. On this unit, it was about 50 millivolts, which isn't huge, but still much more than I would like to see, and luckily nowhere near as bad as the Soloist 3X that L7 Audiolab measured. That had over half a volt at the very beginning. So do not turn this on or off whilst you've got anything connected to it, because it could potentially break your headphones, and don't connect anything until about 3 or so minutes have passed and it's warmed up a bit, because again, the DC offset, especially with something more sensitive, could potentially cause damage. That is not a great start for this amp, but I felt like I had to put those warnings right at the beginning of the video. So, what about sound? Well, this is a very powerful amplifier, offering comfortably over 10 watts into 32 ohms and a little over 24 volts into high impedance loads, so you should be able to run basically anything you want off this. It is going to be able to drive them without hitting any hard limits. But this is also one of the examples where a product's max power spec doesn't necessarily tell the whole story about how well it's going to be able to drive more difficult headphones like a Modhouse Tungsten or a HiFiMan Susvara OG. In my main headphone system, I use the Ferrum 1 La GSE as my DAC and the Zale HM1 as my amplifier, and obviously those are a bit of a different price point to this, but I always like to start comparisons by comparing to what I'm most familiar with and components that I've found to be an excellent reference point. With sensitive headphones like an Austrian Audio Composer, or more moderately difficult headphones like the HiFiMan Aria Unveiled, the Conductor sounded mostly fine. Bass was pretty punchy, it overall sounded pretty clear and detailed, and with these more easy to drive headphones, the amplifier had a sound that I would overall describe as slightly dense, but treble forward. It is a slightly warm amp. Mid-range in particular is given a little bit of extra heft, accompanied by some treble that is a little bit more energetic than on some other sources. The snares in tracks like Hosier's Movement, for example, were a little bit more aggressive than what was coming out of my Wanda and HM1 system, but it's hard to say for certain how much of this is the amp and how much is the DAC, since with no true analog inputs, I'm comparing two fully separate chains rather than just two different amps. The end result was that this sounded immediately thicker and a bit more aggressive. This does have the effect of slightly falling behind on raw technical performance. For busier tracks like Pain by the War on Drugs, it wasn't all that easy to pick out and focus only on one particular element in the mix. Particularly in the mid-range, things start to blend over each other a little bit, and it's not super well separated. The more forward and aggressive treble does help to make this sound more technical and detailed than it otherwise would, given that mid-thickness, but it does feel a little bit forced to my ear. It's not actually got more detail, it's just a bit more aggressive with the information that is there, and at times bordering on a little bit fatiguing. The much harder to drive Modhouse Tungsten and HiFiMan Susvara OG though were much different stories. Swapping between the Ferrum Ore or the Zale HM1 and the Burson Conductor, the differences I heard with those were not the same as the more sensitive headphones. These two headphones sounded notably more blunted on the Burson, a little bit more soft and pillowy in the low end, more like the amp was struggling a bit and kind of holding things back. And in addition to that, the treble had a noticeably more grainy sort of presentation to it, which then crossed that border into being fatiguing. Comparing this directly against an HM1 and a Wandler might seem like a bit of a pointless comparison. What about something closer in price, or indeed something far cheaper, like a shit Midgard? Well, I did that, and that's where I really started to feel less keen on the value proposition here. The Midgard drove all four of these headphones just plain better. It has an overall similar level of general warmth, maybe a tad more neutral, but the treble in particular just sounded more refined. The treble was a little bit less edgy and aggressive, but still just as, if not more revealing of these small, low-level details compared to the Burson. The Burson kind of felt like it was shouting at you a little bit with a raspier voice, whereas the Midgard was just talking at a little more comfortable level and actually having more depth to the information that it was providing. But the other thing, and the potentially more stark contrast between the two, was with the Susvara OG in particular. This is the much more powerful amp. This is far more powerful, several times more powerful than the Midgard. But as I said earlier, this is an example of an amp where the raw power specs don't necessarily give you the full picture of how well it's going to actually drive difficult headphones, because on the Midgard, the Susvara OG just sounded more authoritatively driven, tighter, better controlled, and slightly punchier. If we have a look at some of the measurements, we can see why. The Conductor is an incredibly powerful device, again offering over 10 watts into 32 ohms, but it starts rising in distortion quite early, around 0.1 watts into 32 ohms. By comparison, the Midgard keeps very consistent behavior up to about 2 watts output, so even though the Burson is several times more powerful than the Midgard, the midguard is behaving much better for the difficult and quite high output levels that you are actually going to be driving into your headphones. This is something we talked about in our Do I Need an Amp video. The power spec of an amp alone doesn't actually tell you how well it's going to drive things, and you do kind of need to look at how it's going to behave at the levels you're going to be outputting. Anyway, let's talk a little bit more about the measurements, because unfortunately, the Conductor's objective performance is a little bit mediocre as well. Getting just over -90 dB total harmonic distortion and noise, it falls fairly far behind other options, including the similarly priced Ferrum Ore and the much cheaper shit midguard. The distortion also rises both as output level and as frequency increase quite notably, so it's not all that consistent in performance. The noise floor is relatively high, which leaves only 66 dB dynamic range for sensitive IEMs, and not providing a particularly pretty output for low-level signals. One other interesting thing was that setting my dummy load to be a more challenging reactive load rather than just purely resistive caused it to start behaving quite strangely, with many weird sidebands around the harmonics on the output. And then IMD, intermodulation distortion, was a good 10 to 20 dB higher than many competitors. Crosstalk was quite good though, even under load, and jitter performance on the DAC was excellent as well. I am not in the camp of the lowest distortion, best measuring thing is the best sounding thing. There are many reasons why I'm using the Ferrum 1 GSE and the Zale HM1 as my main setup, rather than an SMSL Raw Pro DAC and a topping A90 for example. But what I will say is that the best sounding devices I have heard have all been ones that measured at least pretty well. Anything that I've tested that did measure in colored ways sounded colored to me in some fashion, and that's not always a bad thing. A tube amp with a nice even order descending profile won't sound neutral and it doesn't measure neutral, but I might like what it's doing. A Woo-Wah 23 is not a transparent amplifier, but damn, that thing sounds good. Objective colorations are something which I always find then contributes to subjective colorations, and it's just a question of whether those colorations are enjoyable or not. But here, the much more odd order focused distortion profile, which odd order harmonic distortion tends to make things sound a little bit more etchy and bright in some cases, possibly explaining some of the reasons I didn't like the treble on this amp so much, leads to a sound that is fine, but not worth the price. It's a little aggressive, a little unrefined, and for me personally, I would happily either sacrifice some of the technical performance this has and go for a more pleasant sounding HiFiMan EF400, or improve upon the neutrality, get something more authoritative and detailed and far cheaper, like the shit midguard. But then if you are still happy to spend a reasonable amount, something like a Ferrum Ore, just with the stock power supply, not the Hypsos or anything, I felt was an overall upgrade and just a better sounding amp than the Conductor. But quite frankly, the sound of the Conductor is not really the concern for me. I mean, just the fact that the startup shutdown sequence on this is potentially dangerous is pretty unnerving. There is no reason why this should be flinging over 30 volts through the headphone output. What happens if I get a power cut whilst I'm listening to this? What happens if I just forget to unplug my headphones before I turn it on or off? And then there's the more minor concerns, like the fact that the analog inputs on this device are seemingly not actually a fully analog signal path, so you can use an external DAC on it, but you're not going to get any benefit from using one, and in fact the analog inputs perform substantially worse than just using the internal DAC. Or the fact that actually if you do use an external DAC, unless you turn the signal level down a fair bit, it's just going to clip the inputs. And then there's just the fact that the objective performance of this is pretty mediocre as well, considering the price. I don't feel that this is a well-engineered device. I don't think it sounds as good as it needs to for the money, and I think the risks in using it are pretty concerning, especially since this isn't just the first unit, but not even the first model from Burson carrying similar issues. Hopefully their current lineup of products is better, but we'll find out soon. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you've got any questions you wanted to ask about the Conductor 3X, any other products mentioned in this video, headphones, DACs, amps, music, gear, or anything else at all, then come and say hey on a headphones.com Discord server or the headphones.com forum, where I and other wiggly air enthusiasts will endeavor to help. Till next time, I'm GoldenSound, you're watching The Headphone Show by headphones.com. Thanks for watching.